This is an exclusive presentation of the Foreign Press Association.
Welcome everyone to this evening's digital broadcast presented by the Foreign Press Association and Foundation. I'm Jeff Oppenheim, your host for this evening's program, Pandemic and the Pentagon, How COVID-19 Impacted the United States Military. I'm going to introduce my guests in just a moment, but before I do, just a few bits of housekeeping, if you would. First of all, I want to make sure to let everybody know that, of course, the Foreign Press Association and Foundation is a nonprofit organization and therefore relies on contributions from not only foundations and corporations, but as they say, viewers like you. So the best way to show your support, of course, is to become a member or be sure to renew your membership tonight. And at the very least, make sure you sign up for our mailing list so you can stay on top of the various programs that we do. Of course, I also want to remind you how you can do that, which is through our website, which is theforeignpressassociation.org, or through email, sending an email to fpa@foreignpressassociation.org. I also want to take a moment to thank my associates for this evening. And of course, I owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Robert Saunders, who's joining us tonight, who also helped me put together this program, along with our own executive director, Jonathan Bruce King, who has the dubious honor this evening of course, serving as our TD. So thank you again, Jonathan, for doing that. So on that note, without further ado, I want to introduce our panel this evening. First of all, joining us tonight in our digital studio is Vice Admiral James W. Crawford III. Admiral Crawford was the 43rd Judge Advocate General of the Navy. He was the principal military legal counsel to the Secretary of the Navy and Chief of Naval Operations, and served as the Department of Defense Representative Policy Affairs, REPOA, and he also led 2,300 attorneys, enlisted legal men, and civilian employees of the worldwide Navy JAG Corps community. Admiral Crawford previously served as legal counsel to the Chairman, Joint Chief of Staffs, and also as Commander to NATO Rule of Law Field Support Mission, Rule of Law Field Force Afghanistan. Admiral, thank you so much for being here this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Returning to our studios, the aforementioned Robert A. Sanders, LPD, JD, LLM, National Security Department Chair of the Henry C. Lee College of Criminal Justice and Forensic Sciences, U.S. Navy Judge, also JAG as well, Advocate General Corps, Captain retired. He has served as a staff attorney and legislative director working with the United States Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives, as a federal civil defense counsel and as a federal criminal prosecutor and defense counsel in the United States, afloat on Navy ships, and of course, overseas. Dr. Sanders also serves on the board of the directors of the Blue Cross Blue Shield of Rhode Island. So, Dr. Sanders, thank you for being here.
Pleasure to be back.
And also returning to our studios this evening is Alfred R. Turner, Captain, U.S. Navy retired, Associate Professor of Joint Military Operations Department at the U.S. Naval War College, a 30-year Naval Intelligence and Information Warfare Officer. He served as the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence for Fleet Cyber Command, U.S. 10 Fleet. Captain Turner also served as Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence on the U.S. Theodore Roosevelt Strike Group. Certainly something that will come up tonight. Again, great to have you back in the digital studio, Captain Turner.
Thanks, Jeff. My pleasure.
I want to jump right in, but before I do, first of all, we just passed Memorial Day, so I would be remiss without saying a hearty thank you for your service, gentlemen, and of course to all the men and women who serve in the United States military. So thank you. Let's keep it on that level too. I want to really keep it first and foremost on the human level, the factor, because I find often when we report on things that relate to the military, we talk about it as an institution. We think of the Pentagon, just as we label tonight's program, rather than the individual men and women that truly make up the U.S. military and every military force around the world. So let's start there. How has COVID-19 impacted the men and women that serve, as well as their families?
Well, to start off with, former military members stepping back and watching from the cheap seats now, our former friends and colleagues, their activities changed drastically in many ways. In other ways, they stayed exactly the same because the threats continue to exist. And at that, I'd like to ask, just kind of let the Admiral jump in on part of that and add to that piece of it.
Yeah, I think with anything, you have to start with first principles, and leadership is certainly a first principle here, and leadership is going to be the key to us being successful. So we understand that first we start with the big picture, that the objective is to ensure that the force remains fully capable for global deterrence missions as science works its way toward a vaccine. Circumstances have been such that leadership has had to make rapid decisions. They've had to do that under intense pressure. They've had to do that without a great deal of information. And obviously that's nothing new to the military. But when you make rapid decisions, you clearly deviate from normal practice. And when you do that, you end up with the potential for uneven burden sharing across your force. So they have to be attuned to that, and that's particularly important when you're thinking about the health and safety of families in the force. A key factor here is that, unfortunately for us, is that the military is not a high risk demographic, young folks, but we also have to be attuned to particular folks that are maybe more sensitive, as well as the community writ large. And again, so that means that in my sense, we really need to give a lot of credit to our commanders, who OSD is given the flexibility to exercise their judgment in order to protect and ensure their forces are protected, their personnel are protected, to determine what sorts of protocols they need to put in place. And I think we can see some success. I know a lot of the attention is spent on the Roosevelt, but if you look at, as of late April, there were 5,000 diagnosed COVID cases out of 1.3 million active duty personnel. While one case is obviously one too many, because that puts one sailor and his family or her family at risk, that's not a bad record as they are working forward. So the sorts of measures, pandemic procedures that have been put in place by commanders, cutting back on large scale sorts of exercises, immediately giving guidance to the force and their families starting in February, I think are some of the things that have worked toward ensuring that we continue to have a fully capable mission force.
Let me jump in there too and ask very specifically. I mean, social distancing is not an option necessarily in the cities that are within cities that represent military bases. How do you not only institute some form of diligence there, and furthermore, within other cities, as you are guests of those cities, how are we mitigating the civilian to military interaction?
Well, certainly the Navy, as well as all the other forces, I'm going to speak to the Navy a little bit, is certainly employing social distancing as best as it can. Obviously, when you're in tight confines up on ships and submarines, that's a little more difficult. And guidance has obviously been given to the fleet to reduce large-scale gatherings so that they can reduce the potential for infection. They have also, prior to deployment, they've created, if you will, I would say, a non-COVID bubble by trying to reduce the movement of personnel so they reduce their exposure, so that when they do go aboard ship, after that prolonged period in a protected environment, it reduces the potential for infection. Also, I have learned that it was reported that the Navy IG, working with the Chief of Naval Operations Office and working with PAC Fleet, as well as Fleet Forces in Norfolk, will engage in a review of how the Navy mitigation measures are working aboard ship. And this will lead them toward developing better procedures to ensure that our personnel and their families and the communities in which they live in, and I think that's critical, it's not just the force, it's the families and the communities in which they live are better protected.
Well, let me turn to Captain Turner here, especially working as you do at the college. We've seen a lot with issues arise with military academies at this point, not only in terms of the final preparation for training in your test practices, but also now major issues regarding graduation ceremonies. tell me from your personal observations and also wearing two hats, as it were, as a teacher as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So when the pandemic first struck and the various schools command took a look at the situation, we began to immediately start to restrict our interaction with students and their families as a starting point. And this would be what we did at the Naval War College, for example. And certainly by about, actually the middle of March, we went to everybody go home. So that's at some of the senior service schools. At OCS, which Officer Candidate School, so training for officers coming through Newport, I know they restricted their activities severely to start out with, took a situation, assessed situation and the risk, and then as they came up with new procedures to be able to protect their students as well as the staff, and again, it's a very low risk group, as the Admiral just mentioned a second ago. And so even as of a couple weeks ago, driving across the base, you see that they're back again, undertaking basic activities to get training going again. But so there was a slight disruption followed by reflection and then implementing procedures. And so we're now getting back on step.
So adding to that a little bit, one of the things that the military is known for is our physical fitness. And, you need to be physically fit to fight a ship that's on fire, or fight a ship in combat, to run up and down a hill if you're in the Army and the Marine Corps, or to fly your plane for a long distance time if you're in the Air Force, take care of that. So one of the things the Air Force just decided to do was they're not going to have PT tests through October, because they feel that their force, in terms of readiness for those type of tests, which determine whether people can stay or must be ejected from the services, COVID has impacted that. The interaction, the availability to close your gyms, the social distancing requirements that go along with not being able to PT have taken away from their ability to be ready in that sense. So they're going to not test anybody until October. The Navy SEALs just began working out again, in the sense that they put their buds back in the water on the beach. Famous pictures carrying the raft, carrying the log. That all just began again within the last 2 weeks. As Captain Turner just mentioned a minute ago, the Navy OCS, they shut down their physical training for a period of time because of this. It's impacted recruitment. You can't recruit in a social distance environment. How do you go and talk to students at a high school if you're trying to recruit enlisted kids when there's no high school in session? How do you go to a college and do the same thing when there's no college in session? So those things have had an impact on the pipeline. And the other end of that is, so to address that, the Army, the Navy, I'm not sure about the Air Force and the Marine Corps, but they have both issued orders or offers of orders to officers and some senior enlisted and special rates who would be leaving to stay for an extra year and not go home, so that these critical billets can be filled and the ability for the mission, as the Admiral mentioned, can continue, because the mission continuing is required. And lastly, one of the things that I thought was an interesting and maybe a little bit premature activity was a ban on anyone who has had COVID to be able to serve in the military in the future. I don't know all the rationale behind that, but I think it's a bit premature to blanketly wipe out all those who had this particular virus at this point. Maybe a stay, on their recruitment because we don't know whether or not antibodies have built up and whether or not they are actually contagious, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But for a lifetime ban in this time frame, maybe a bit premature.
So
I think
sorry.
Rob, you're right on, and I think the services are at least DOD has recognized that. I think recently the chairman has come out and indicated that it's not likely where they are presently. I think they're still working through the idea of how they're going to handle accessions. So the memo that that you were referring to that got out, I think they're thinking through that as opposed to having imposed a ban. I think, from my understanding, that is not the case at this point. They're still thinking about it, and I think your point about the recruiting piece is sensible in the sense, while they may be using digital means at the moment, and digital means seems to be making their targets. They have to start thinking. You lose probably 15 to 20% every year, as you know, through just normal attrition. So that means you have to replace that 15 to 20% in some fashion. And your point about the extensions, so they're going to have to look at the retention piece and utilize whatever measures and incentives that they can to get people to stay on active duty longer, to not retire, not engage in separations. And they should be able to do that in this sort of slowed economy fairly well. But prudent planning suggests to me that DOD will look at all options. And stop loss is one of the things that I'm sure will come up at some point in time, someone reporting that. But I doubt very seriously that will not be something that DOD will engage in. They would diligently look to avoid that. As you know, it was used for the first time in the Gulf War in 1990. It was used in Bosnia and Kosovo. It was also used pretty broadly after 9/11. But former Secretary of Defense Gates was very clear when he worked toward ensuring that was ended by 2011. That was not likely the best route for the department, and I'm certain the department understands that presently. And I think volunteer processes will probably work to maintain in strength as needed.
Well, let me follow up that in general with these various issues. Oftentimes in wartime, we'll end up in a situation where we hear sort of bureaucratic side, the Pentagon side, the non-in-the-field general is making some quarterbacking decisions, which often go against the intel that they're getting from on the ground, from their commanders that they've placed in charge on the ground. Are we in another situation like that, such as I point to the graduation debacle that is still sort of waging its war at this point, at West Point, with the president, the executive branch insisting we regroup these kids coming back for a live graduation, despite the on-the-ground, if you would, field marshals of the school saying, no, not advisable. Same thing with this, in essence, a COVID 4F. Are we taking in full intel from the soldiers on the ground, the troops on the ground, the commanders on the ground there?
Well, first, let me say I hope that the voice of the commanders at the service academies are being heard by their superiors. So what did the commanders of the service academies do? After Thanksgiving, they sent their young men and women home because the environment was not conducive to keep them on board. Just as we did at the University of New Haven, we sent our young men and women home because you couldn't social distance and do school in the same sense that we had done school. We had to do something different. So each service academy did something slightly different. So, West Point sent everyone home. The Naval Academy sent everyone home. The Air Force Academy sent the non-seniors, the non-graduating individuals home. And they stayed. So when their graduation time came around, they hadn't been home, they hadn't contracted any new contagious diseases from third parties at home. They didn't bring it back to campus and infect the campus and cause other things to happen. They kind of went into a lockdown, as Fred Turner just mentioned, as the OCS did on board the Naval Station in Newport, Rhode Island. So those students were able to be screened, tested, and all of that in a very tight, sterile environment. And they brought in the vice president, and he did a graduation ceremony under those circumstances, where you saw the checkerboard of social distance for all of the Air Force cadets at graduation and commissioning process. The Navy commissioned these young men and women at home. They did a virtual graduation. As a matter of fact, some are graduating tonight and commissioning right this moment. They're doing the Zoom graduation process and a commissioning process. West Point sent those young women who went home for the same reasons, but they're being brought back. The seniors are being brought back. So whatever was shut down, food services, housing, support for housing, all that has to be cranked back up, brought back to life, and made available for the seniors. Now, with less students, you can better social distance. You could probably put one student per room and things like that. But is there a modicum of danger to this group of young officers in being brought back to graduate in this manner so that POTUS can officiate? That's yet to be determined, but it is a good question to be asked by someone, and having confidence in the leadership that they made a decision. Hopefully what has happened is not contrary to how they initially planned to do this and the initial decision to protect those young men and women.
Well, another place that we're putting the young men and women on the line here, of course, is the deployment in terms of supporting civilian care, right? Putting out and supporting civilian services, healthcare services. And there's a tradition of that in the military, is there not? And how is that the same or different of what we're seeing at this point?
So we have a thing that HADR, where we support disaster relief around the world. One thing that you see from the Navy side, you often would see the Comfort or the Mercy show up in a port and provide medical service, or a large amphibious ship carrying Marines show up and provide services to build roads with CBs, or to build houses, do almost Habitat and Humanity type of things. Or the organization that I read at one point in my career, which was essentially the Department of Defense's International Law School, where our job was to go to sometimes 170 countries in a year on the ground and provide rule of law instruction, anti-terrorism instruction, anti-corruption instruction to their military and their divisions of interior. That's face-to-face, hands-on, on the ground in other countries. Oftentimes during that time frame, we had issues like SARS, we had MERS. So we had to develop protocols to do that. The mission continued to an extent, but we also had to scale back to where it was dangerous to put our people on the ground in those environments, and was the risk-reward balance had to be one, made by the commander, and then two, made by the commander's boss. So whenever I put people into a hostile fire zone, my 3-star and I had to have a conversation about that before I put people on the ground. So it's the same. We're talking about a concern, a threat. It's just viral. And when you put your people in front of a threat, there are things that need to be done.
Well, let me turn to the Admiral on this, specifically as we're talking about risk assessment, right? We normally in the past had that procedure, as Dr. Sanders just referred to, of relying on the agencies, various agencies' reports. So actually drill down, if you could, on whatever agencies that generally the military relies on when they're going into a geo-specific mission, as to what the troops might encounter on the grounds there in terms of any pandemic or any illnesses or diseases. What is that protocol that's already there that you alluded to, Doctor?
Well, I would DoD engages in a detailed risk assessment framework to assess and organize its actions and give guidance for threat to deployed forces. And it interacts with a number of agencies in order to be able to provide advice. Obviously, the Undersecretary for Personnel and Readiness, really for OSD, really has a lead for that sort of thing. And part of that will be providing guidance for health protection conditions, very much like force protection conditions, and what sort of status, the guidance and the criteria that commanders utilize in order to determine what HPCon their forces should be in, and how that is structured, how high in the command echelon those authorities reside. I note that on March 11th of 2020, and I'm looking at it here, as I mentioned before, now back here at the Undersecretary, the performing the duties of the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, issued a memorandum for the Force Health Protection Guidance Supplement for the Department of Defense guidance for personnel traveling during this novel coronavirus outbreak. And what this is intended to do is to supplement the existing DoD instruction that provides guidance on public health emergency management. So that is just part of a very robust structure that exists within the department that flows down through the military departments, which is then executed through the services to ensure that the forces are protected based on a very rational framework.
Let me turn to Captain Turner, if I might. Specifically, now we're talking about deployment within cities, but we can turn to the U.S. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, and dare I call it even the scandal that came out about that. What can we learn from that? How is that kind of deployment slightly different in terms of on-ship control, the lessons learned there, and then even on the civilian interaction there with shore leave?
So it's really interesting what's happened, of course. So the Theodore Roosevelt is now in the process of working up off of Guam. So a little less than 2 months after they first pulled into Guam, they are now getting back to training and getting ready to continue their deployment. But immediately after the issue with the Theodore Roosevelt Strike Group, the Navy implemented a number of measures to ensure, one, the readiness of the force and the ability to respond to any potential threats. And specifically what the Navy did was holding ships and strike groups. They held the Truman Strike Group off the East Coast and still do, to ensure, the ship was COVID free, and to ensure that they didn't infect that ship, they limited movement back and forth to the ship, and basically kept her in readiness in case they needed to deploy. At the same time, they ensured, even though the Roosevelt couldn't continue its mission, that amphibious ready group, the American Amphibious Ready Group, that took up some of the mission that the Theodore Roosevelt Strike Group was going to undertake in the South China Sea. With ships that were already important in the middle of workups, they began to, first of all, do the risk assessment and then come up with procedures to be able to safely get them underway. And so just, I think it was earlier this month, the Ronald Reagan Strike Group just got underway from Japan. And they actually went through a procedure where they held, they did almost a rolling embarkation of the Reagan Strike Group by first bringing the sailors to places that were essentially quarantine type facilities, allowed them to continue activities and training ashore, but keep them isolated from the populace, as well as not put them onto the ship yet. And then they tested everybody from within those facilities. And then they brought them to the ship, and now the ship's underway and it's COVID free. During that procedure, they detected 16 asymptomatic cases, removed them from the pool of people before they embarked them, and now the Reagan Strike Group is underway off of the southeast of Japan. Yeah, and in the meantime, you had another ship, the flagship of Seventh Fleet out in Japan, that spends a lot of time in the Western Pacific. She's been underway for, until just recently, for 100 days straight. She broke her own record. Previous to that, she'd been underway for, I think, 70 or 60 some days straight, 68 days straight in 1972 during Vietnam. And until that time, she's basically a ship that typically undertakes a lot of port visits, and they've held her at sea for the last 100 days. Just recently brought her into Okinawa, but they are only allowing the sailors off into on the pier and the beach, keep them isolated from the general populace, so to keep them protected, as well as keep the populace, I presume, protected, but really in this case the sailors, and so the ship can get back underway. So we've already implemented procedures to try to maintain forces forward, and I think we've done a pretty good job doing it. The question is going to be how long you can keep some of these ships at sea and the sailors and the operational tempo, both from a maintenance standpoint, but also a personal operational tempo. It begins to increase stress, obviously, among everybody who's afloat that long. I can tell you from personal experience. I think the two gentlemen with me as well could attest to that as well.
I can imagine, absolutely. And I've heard that from other friends that have served, especially on a ship. Let me do a follow-up to that then. It sounds like things might have been slowed to some degree, but has anything been severely restricted or stopped? Any areas that we have had to pull back completely from overseas activities?
Well, I mean, just from what I just brought up with the Blue Ridge, I mean, her mission beyond being the Seventh Fleet flagship is really to undertake engagement missions with partners and allies. So she spends a lot of time going in out of ports of countries that the U.S. is close to in the Pacific, and obviously she can't do that mission right now. I'm sure that the Navy's trying to figure out ways to begin to do this again. But those port visits are an important part of at least a large part of the day-to-day mission of the Navy. And the same goes throughout the world. When you have a ship that's overseas deployed in the Gulf, for example, right now there's in the Gulf, Amphibious Ready Group. There's also the Eisenhower Strike Group in the North Arabian Sea. All of this is available. You can see it online where they're all working. They typically would be in and out of port, engaging with, again, so face-to-face interaction has been scaled. Side, we are continuing exercises with those partners and nations. Just recently, I actually just selected a smaller Navy ships, littoral combat ship, just engaged in a exercise Navy, and there are a number of others that worked recently the last 2 months where we've continued those operations. So some level continuing, another level not so much on the maybe more diplomatic side.
So I add to that a little bit. In the military, we have a usual transfer time of the year, which is now upon us, basically. End of the school year, spring and summer. And we typically send, when schools let out, our sailors and families to their foreign duty stations. Well, some of those foreign duty stations are Italy, Spain, Japan. So there was actually a hold put on some of those, rightfully so, the deployments of service members and their families, and a hold on rotating back from those places, service members and their families, so that we can get a better grip on exactly what's happening with the populations there in terms of COVID-19. You don't want to push folks into an environment where you may have to then pull them out, and you don't want to pull folks out prematurely where you haven't done all the screening and testing that's necessary to then put them back into another group in society, i.e. the United States, where they have not been fully screened and vetted to engage in the way that we needed to engage on the ground here. As these states open up, so will at some point these military bases in the United States. And the bases overseas will begin to open up consistent with what is good for readiness, good for safety and health of the troops and their families, and mission accomplishment. So all of that stuff has to be looked at slowly, carefully, and meticulously, and not jumped into. So the slowdown and the hold is the right thing to do. Just how long we can maintain those could be problematic.
Now, if I could, I think we have to keep in mind as we discuss this that clearly something of this nature was contemplated. And so they're not operating from a blank slate. I think what we're seeing is that perhaps maybe operating in a pandemic environment is more complicated than perhaps had been anticipated. But I think you'll see a great deal of innovation come out of this from the services and the Department of Defense overall in terms of how to operate in the future. So I would expect right now that there is a great deal of planning teams have been put together on the operational strategic levels to begin to look at not just current operations, but look forward. You can't be so fixated on the present that you fail to look forward, otherwise you're not ready for what comes next. And clearly, as author Thomas Friedman said, living in an age of acceleration, events like this are similar, with similar effects will happen again. So this planning is not necessarily designed to just deal with a pandemic, but it's designed to develop contingency thought. It's not the specific plans, it's the planning that's important. So they can think through how the resilience that's necessary, modifications in operations that is necessary. So what's the defense budget, the variables they'll be thinking about, defense budget, they'll be thinking about the vulnerabilities that they've seen and what others are seeing and how to mitigate those, as well as looking at strategic opportunities that are presented. So while this may be a difficult circumstance, clearly lots of activity is going on right now that we are not privy to that will enable the force overall, the joint force overall, to come out of this better prepared.
So is, in fact, pandemic training and preparedness part of now a permanent military protocol?
It always was. It's varied depending on which administration has been in place since the George Bush the Younger through the Obama administration and into the current Trump administration. So we've had some planning in place on the board. The funding has varied. There was just a report from I think the St. Louis Dispatch that talked about the gutting of the plans and the funding and the readiness to build up the stockpile that was done in the budget cutting done in this administration from the last administration. Hopefully that'll be a lesson learned, because that was also a lesson learned in the Obama administration. In the Obama administration, they began to scale down, and Ebola came. And Ebola was an eye-opener and an awakening, and they began to step back into the arena and began to plan again. Unfortunately, a lot of what they put together was taken down in terms of budget and actual control factors by this current administration.
Well, I also want to ask and flag one area that we have often seen the military serve. It might be too grand a word here, but a recent story about the VA hospital being provided with a lot of the hydroxychloroquine. And by provided might be a word that's worth investigating, whether that was a military contract and had money attached to it, but to presumably begin vaccines of that with our young men and women that might be in the VA hospital. I have to ask, is this another example of something like the Tuskegee Airmen experiments, what are we anticipating here? What's that situation?
I certainly hope not, not a Tuskegee experiment type of activity. You know, I stand on the shoulders of the Golden 13, the first commissioned officers in modern history of the United States Navy. And when I stand on their shoulders, I want to look out at my society and think that we're not doing things like we did things in the past that are problematic. And clearly, this particular drug has some issues. For instance, Monday, the WHO decided that it was no longer going to be part of its protocols for testing, trying to get to a vaccine or at least some type of mediation medicine against COVID-19. You can say a lot of positive and negative things about the WHO and how they handled China along the way, but I'm hopeful that their action is indicative of saying that this is not the direction we need to go on. And if we were going in that direction with the VA, I hope the VA has taken stock of that and moved in another direction.
I think a lot can be learned, obviously, from the letter that Secretary Wilkie sent in response back to Senator Schumer, where he tried to respond to the query about what was going on with this particular product in the VA. And there are some valid uses for this product, separate and apart from COVID. And we also know that there are other medical institutions that are studying this drug for its effectiveness or lack of effectiveness. So I'm not sure the VA is so separate, but I think it's a fair question that's being asked by oversight, if you will, committees within, if it is a committee question, if not just a question from the senator about what is actually being done, why is it being done, how is it being used, and why was it acquired? Because it was a product that was already in the VA, from my understanding, in the VA inventory well before COVID-19.
And that's correct. It was, because it's used for lupus and other treatments, but this is an off-label job, an off-label work, an off-label experiment, so to speak. And I will remain concerned because the Hippocratic Oath says first do no harm. It doesn't say first experiment.
Yeah, and we're also dealing with a population that often puts, as by training, mission over self. So it seems to me a very prime population to test this on, if that is indeed what's going on. I see that we're starting to back up in questions, so I want to, in order to open up questions here, I have one that came in from a colleague of mine that I was speaking to before we did the broadcast. He's originally from France. He's now in Houston. And I guess being from France, he also served in the military there where it's mandatory. And his question was, can lessons from COVID help the armed forces prepare for biological warfare? Who would like to field that?
I'm sure they can. You know, the force protection is force protection. So what do you want to do? You want to keep your forces healthy and able to do the mission. So we had an example of where we failed in this force protection in the influenza pandemic of 1918, where over 40,000 in various locations of the U.S. Army went down and were not able to perform the missions. Thankfully, at the time, they were not part of the troops that were going to be fighting on the front lines of World War I. But if they had been, that would have severely reduced our ability to meet the challenge that Germany posed and support our allies. So the military is constantly learning lessons from things that they do right and things that they do wrong. You actually learn more lessons from what you do wrong than from what you do right. So there's a planning cell someplace that is taking into account not only everything that happened in 1918, but what we learned from MERS, what we learned from SARS, and we're going to stack on top of all of that what we learned from COVID and put it into the system to better prepare our forces to be ready for whatever may come, that's vaccine and viral.
I wouldn't want to, just from my perspective, equate what's happening now with a biologic sort of event, intentional biologic and targeted sort of event. I think those are fairly substantially different, but clearly lessons can be learned from operating in a compromised environment. I think you could, whether you want to call COVID-19, where a viral spread of a virus creates a compromised environment, I think that's a bit different than the sort of compromised environment that you're thinking about when you think about a biologic. So while there are clearly always lessons to be learned, I think probably some caution should be taken by equating one with the other, because they're totally different in character.
Yeah, I would add that, if the top lesson from any biologic event is probably that biological weapons aren't really the way to go for any nation state or even non-state actor that isn't automatically suicidal. From the where the two intersect, and where I see it is in very often how the military, we use expertise that we have learned from various outbreaks, whether Ebola in 2014 to 2016, influenza back World War I time frame, even Hong Kong flu in 1968. And you bring that back to study it, and a lot of it revolves around Fort Detrick, Maryland, and the work those folks do. In fact, one of the units deployed to West Africa, to Liberia in 2014 to 2016, was actually a chem biologic, a CNBC. So basically a unit that specializes in this type of warfare and being able to control it. So that, to me, is where the intersection really comes about, is back to this lesson piece where we can learn and bring that back and protect ourselves in the event an actor, whether state or non-state, ever decided to employ a biological weapon. Not in any way do I believe this is the case, just to make that clear. Certainly not in this case at all.
So Jeff, the one thing I would add is, there are points of departure, and we would call those gaps, but there are seams here, and the seams are in lessons learned. What do we find out when we encounter these things, and how can we put that information to use for what's coming next?
Well said. Thank you. Let's turn this over to Jonathan, because I do see a few questions that have come across our screen. Jonathan, would you like to lead that for us?
One is we have a civilian professional working on a major military installation in Europe, and he has been impressed by the way command and personnel have worked to mitigate the effects of COVID-19. Are there lessons from the military response that could be applied to the civilian population?
I think there are, but you also have to remember now the civilian population, particularly civilian population in the United States, under the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, and the 10th Amendment, have different ways in which they will be dealt with than the military population on a base, where saluting smartly and taking an order might be the only thing that is available to them in response if it's a lawful order given by a lawful commander for a lawful reason. So we need to distinguish how the military may be required to respond and the options that civilians may have in their own response.
What ways does COVID-19 impact military training once the pandemic is over?
Well, in terms of, I would say what I understand about how, let's say, the Marine Corps and the Army has adapted. So what the Marine Corps has done down in Parris Island is that they've established a 2-week staging period for recruits before they are integrated into training. And during that 2 weeks, they will reside at the Citadel, and they will undergo screening and monitoring, obviously. And those who are ready after that screening and monitoring, are eligible, I should say, will then be integrated into training. something similar has been done with the Army. The Army initially stood down its training for 2 weeks. I think it was in late April, during the time it developed screening and monitoring protocols in order to figure out how to train and keep recruits safe. They have started up again, I know at Fort Leonard Wood, and they're doing a similar thing, a 2-week period where they are isolated, screened, and they're monitored for that 2-week period. During that 2-week period, they go through academic sort of training. And after that period, they will be integrated into training pretty much as they would have been prior to COVID-19. So these sorts of lessons, screening, monitoring, those sorts of lessons in order to space out the training cohorts are the things that will probably translate beyond COVID-19.
I think one of the other things to add on to that is just the testing routines. So we saw a testing regime established in order to repopulate the Theodore Roosevelt and to keep it underway and safe with in a COVID-free environment. So what do other ships need to do? That's actually being worked out right now by Fleet Forces Command down in Norfolk to figure out what is the protocol for tomorrow and how we don't run into another pull the ship in as we had to do with the USS Kidd, or stop operations as we had to do with the Theodore Roosevelt.
Yeah, and that's along the lines of what I was talking about earlier, as far as the procedures to get the Reagan Strike Group underway, and that appears to be implemented across the Navy. So we figured out how to get ships underway. I think the next big issue is going to be how do we safely bring them back into port and reintegrate, people and personnel with their families, and then be able to turn them around safely again. For the future, it's going to be interesting as data comes in on COVID-19, as the testing, as we increase testing, as epidemiologists conduct studies and begin to really assess what the true risk is to the population. And then as a vaccine is developed, all these factors are going to impact how many of the changes we're making now are permanent, how many are temporary. I think there's a lot to be determined and where we go from this.
I think the last piece of this also is going forward, and we don't operate in a world by ourselves anymore. We have allies, and those friends and neighbors of ours, very close in this hemisphere and far, far away in other hemispheres, depend on us to engage with them. How do we do that safely? How do we have protocols in place, not just for ourselves, but for them, that will keep us safe at the same time? They are sovereign nations and sovereign militaries, and they get to call their own shots. How we engage with them and how they call those shots, that's the stuff of diplomacy, but it's also the stuff of mill-to-mill engagement. And how we do that going forward is also very important.
So we have another question that kind of touches on that. Is something I think we've actually covered a little, but has the military medical community at large had the opportunity to have their voices heard? And has that had an impact on COVID-19?
Well, it's interesting, we pulled our military folks and put them in the front line, very much so as a part of the triage organizations to relieve and take over where the civilian communities needed help or couldn't do it. It's part of our support to civilian authorities process. We learned lessons from that, and hopefully we'll implement them.
I think it's fair to say that the DoD is engaged in one of the largest domestic military operations in history in support of COVID-19 response. We have the Navy's deployed hospital ships to both coasts. We've got the Army Corps of Engineers have built fully functioning hospitals. The National Guards have been activated in all 50 states. in 3 territories and the District of Columbia. The military is essentially working through mission support for HHS and FEMA. Clearly, this defense support to civilian authority for this surge of medical support could not have been done without intensive consultation and advice from medical experts. It couldn't be executed, which is being executed excellently, without that consultation advice and how to execute. So it would appear to me that one of the best things and lessons to be learned here is how this mission is done. Now that question will beg, will this expand the role of the military in this regard in the future? And I think before you think about that particular question, you need to think about the fact that the military is a finite instrument with a lot of missions and tasks currently. You'll have to think about balance those, what risks you're prepared to accept if you expand it, and what costs you're prepared to bear, and frankly, looking at alternatives and where to invest other than increasing, expanding beyond what the traditional mission of the military is in this regard, perhaps might be a better course, but that's for folks to do further studying.
I see we're coming up on the hour there, Jonathan. Perhaps we have to move the rest of the questions to the comment sections on our social media and on our YouTube channel. Gentlemen, I think we have to bring this to a close. I'll do one wrap question, and briefly as you can. Are there any causes for alarms going forward in the near future, as you can see it from both your military perspective and particularly your intel second hat?
My biggest concern is the Paul Mill issue. We want to keep the politicalization of the military when the military needs to be fighting, one, the invisible threat, COVID, and then two, the increase of activities by Russia, China, unstable North Korea, and a resilient and unpredictable Iran going forward. So I hope that the finger on the trigger and the eye on the target remain without the political dynamic that will cause the military not to provide the best advice to their leadership going forward to solve the problems. There's always a political dynamic because the end state is political, but the ways and means may be military. Hopefully they're the right ways and means for the military, and we're not having the military do, as the Admiral just said, move off into areas where we shouldn't be.
I'll just real quick, but my biggest concern right is, from a military standpoint, is the rather hot tempo that we are engaged in at this point. The wear and tear on material and women, of course. Cost later in to be able to bring ships back up to status after deferred events, people with care and so on. So we'll work through it, but we're going to need resources to be able to do that.
I don't have any concerns, but I would say that the key to the excellence of the U.S. Armed Forces is our personnel. So remaining focused on their health and safety, their emotional well-being, the capacity to deal with this stressful event. And I see that clearly that that's where the services have their fully attentive. I think something that the SecDef said at the Naval Academy, and I'm quoting, while coronavirus is a daunting and in some ways unprecedented challenge, it is just one of the many trials our men and women in uniform will experience throughout their military service. So this isn't new, but it's certainly different. And I have every confidence that our our leadership and our women and men are up to the task of meeting this challenge.
Well, gentlemen, I thank you. This has been a fascinating conversation, almost enough time to cover the depth of this as it impacts the military. I thank you for your service tonight to serve on our panel for the Foreign Press Association and Foundation. I thank you all for joining us tonight and tuning in. If you missed any of this or want to share this broadcast, of course, it will be available probably in about 24 hours on YouTube at the Foreign Press Association and Foundation YouTube site. We also encourage you, if we didn't get to your question, feel free to put the question in the comment section there or on social media as well. And one last nod to say, remind you to support the Foreign Press Association, because your support there is also support of freedom of the press and freedom of speech. Again, I thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Jeff Oppenheim, your host. Until the next time, stay safe, stay well.
Thank you for joining us for this broadcast. To learn more about our digital forums and programs, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. For membership information, please visit www.foreignpressassociation.org and on Twitter at FPA New York. This has been an exclusive presentation of the Foreign Press Association.